Now that I've spoken a little bit about what psychology is in general and a little bit about the history of psychology, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is different perspectives or kind of schools of thought in psychology. And depending on which textbook you would use or which specific class you might have, you might get different perspectives highlighted as sort of like the big ones, the main perspectives in psychology. I am going to talk about 7 modern perspectives. And the reason I picked these 7 is because the textbook I'm using for the class at the moment focused on these 7. I'm making it easier for my students by focusing on those same ones. If you're someone who's watching this from another class, you might have to learn some extras, or you might not have to worry about one of the ones that I go through. Now, one that's almost always covered is something called the psychodynamic approach. So the psychodynamic approach or psychodynamic school of thought, sometimes this is also given the label psychoanalytic. It has its roots in the work of Sigmund Freud, who I had mentioned in previous videos. I'm not sure if in the introductory videos, but Sigmund Freud is often thought of when people say name a famous psychologist. If they don't name Dr. Phil, they often name Sigmund Freud. He actually wasn't a psychologist. He was a medical doctor. He was a neurologist working in Victorian times in Europe. And he is known for founding the psychoanalytic school of thought, which we now call psychodynamic, because typically psychoanalytic is more strictly tied to Freud's teachings and writings. But he developed a form of what we would now call psychotherapy. Psychoanalysis was a type of therapy. Freud was very influential on the field of psychology, even though, as I've said, he wasn't actually a psychologist. Now remember, in psychology is a science. Someone who's actually a psychologist, like we consider Wundt, the first psychologist, the father of psychology, well, he did stuff in the laboratory. He did research. Freud wasn't really big on research. He didn't go out and collect data. He didn't base his work off on, the term is actually based on. I know a lot of people are saying based off these days, and now I catch myself doing it too. It was based on, his work was not based on empirical work, observations, bias-free observations. A lot of his ideas were what he felt to be true, but he didn't go out and test hypotheses. And that is a very important criticism of the psychodynamic approach. And so and I will talk more about Freud in other videos, but some of the basic stuff that we get in the psychodynamic approach is, first of all, the idea that a lot of the influences on behavior are unconscious. Now, a lot of people like to use the word subconscious, but in Freud's work, he used the word unconscious. Unconscious, and that word does have other meanings. A lot of times we say if someone is not awake, they are unconscious. But in terms of the psychodynamic approach or psychoanalysis, unconscious has to do with thoughts, feelings, urges that are not known to the person. Like if you have an unconscious desire, an unconscious urge, that means it's very real and very influential, but you don't have access to it. You can't think actively about it. It's outside of your awareness. The tricky thing about unconscious desires and other phenomena, you can't measure them if they're unconscious. How would you measure something that is unconscious? Some people have tried to figure it out, and we really can't. I mean, by their very nature, they're kind of unknowable, unmeasurable. So this leads to a problem. If psychology is going to be a science, and if we get interested in unconscious drives and urges, but we can't measure them, we can't do studies, we can't do experiments, oh, that's a problem. And that is a criticism. We give attention to the psychodynamic approach because it was very influential. It has strong historic influence on the field. A lot of the work in the field of psychology, especially in the 20th century, a lot of it was inspired by things that Freud or other psychodynamic theorists proposed. Sometimes it inspired work by getting people to try to show that it was wrong, that there were alternatives. It was influential. So we don't study Freud and the psychodynamic approach. We don't study it because it's right. And sometimes that frustrates students. They're like, aren't you supposed to be teaching us the right answers to things? Well, we also go over historical influences, and you can't ignore Freud. He was very influential. Now, other names in the psychodynamic approach would be Carl Jung. It looks like Jung because it's J-U-N-G, but it's Jung. And also Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, was also very influential, very active as in the psychoanalytic field. So psychoanalysis was a type of therapy. We will talk more about that when I go over therapies later in the class. Freud also proposed a theory of development, so he also comes up when we talk about human development, and his theory of development also addressed how personality develops, or how the personality is structured, so he also comes up when we talk about personality. So the psychodynamic approach, even though we've kind of moved beyond and said, well, yeah, there are many other ways we can explain behavior and mental processes, we still talk about them. All right, so who do we have other than Freud, and what do we have other than the psychodynamic approach? Another big one is the behavioral approach, which is sometimes called the learning approach or just behaviorism. There are a lot of big names associated with that, but one kind of core big name is Watson. Another big name is B.F. Skinner, and when we talk about the learning chapter, we're going to go into these guys in more detail. Here, I'm just kind of throwing these out here like, hey, here's some of the ones that might come up. And so with behaviorism, it takes a very different approach than the psychodynamic approach, because with behaviorism, the emphasis is on what you can measure, what you can observe. If you cannot observe something, if you can't do studies on it, it is not within the domain of the behavioral approach. Behaviorists, they say we only care about what we can observe. If we cannot directly observe it, it is not relevant, it is not important. We want to be scientific. We want to be able to collect data. We want to be able to have empirical evidence. And so, and this was also very influential in the 20th century. And let's see, and we'll talk in the learning chapter, we will talk about Watson's famous study of a case study of a 9-month-old infant named Little Albert. That's coming in the future. And Skinner did a lot of animal research, and we'll cover those in the future. Remember, behaviorism, if you can't directly measure it, we don't talk about it. And so what else do we have? Another big perspective in psychology is the humanistic approach, or humanism. And with the humanistic approach, we go back in the other direction. Sometimes this was in the 20th century, especially mid to later part of the 20th century. Sometimes this was presented as like the alternative, the pushback to the behavioral approach. Since behaviorism was so focused on what you could measure, sometimes there were things that were lost. Because some of the things we're interested in as psychologists, you can't get like a direct count or frequency or, the sort of things that are most easily measured. And so we do get this perspective of humanism that emphasize some of those harder to study aspects, like self-esteem, self-expression, reaching one's true potential. That's one of those topics that everybody agrees, like, yeah, that's important to study. How do we measure that? And so there was this sort of recognition, well, we can't directly measure everything. We can talk about some of these important concepts, and we can do our best to conduct studies, but we will have to acknowledge that there are limitations to what we can directly measure. The humanistic approach was very influential on psychotherapy, therapy, interventions, a lot of the applied work that is conducted within the field of psychology. Big names in the humanistic approach are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and they're going to come up when we talk about personality and a little bit with therapy later on. So sometimes humanism gets criticized for not being, truly scientific enough, but again, that influence is very important. You have therapists out there who are like, I am a humanistic therapy. My main focus in therapy is a humanistic approach. And so because of that influence, we do talk about the humanistic approach in psychology. Now, another big one is the cognitive approach. Cognition or cognitive, when you see that word, and it does come up a lot in psychology, it has to do with those mental processes. Thinking, attention, memory, problem solving, things like that. And so with the cognitive approach, they are focused on essentially how we think. Remember how when we talked about the first psychologists like Wundt and Tishner, how they tried to use introspection to figure out how we think, and it didn't really work. It wasn't the best method. And then we stopped thinking about mental processes for a while. We focus more on overt behavior thanks to the influence of the behaviorists. But then we had some advances in the middle of the 20th century in things like computer science, neuroscience, understanding how the brain works, programming computers to try to get them to do things that humans can do. We started to get new insights into how human thinking works. And so we had this resurgence of interest in, hey, we need to address that again. How the heck do we think? How does our thinking work? So cognitive psychologists are focused on our thinking, trying to understand our thought processes, our mental processes with better techniques than what was available when psychology first got started. Better techniques than introspection. Let's see, in terms of big names, you don't need to know any big name associated with cognitive psychology. Now, psychology also overlaps with biology because a lot of the stuff that we're interested in has to do with the nervous system, like the brain and the spinal cord. And so you can't ignore biology, and there's actually, there are people who work in psychology who do a lot of work that you would look at them and you say, oh, that's a biologist. Oh, no, they are a biopsychologist or a physiological psychologist or a psychobiologist. Different names for, these different fields where there's overlap. So we also have the biological approach. With the biological approach, you were looking at the biology, anatomy and physiology that underlie our behavior and mental processes. And so a lot of this was inspired by also advances. Advances in other fields of science allowed us to say, hey, we can apply this to psychology. We can understand behavior and mental processes better with these advances in biology and anatomy and medical science. And so, another approach, the evolutionary approach. I know I do have some students who will let me know that, oh, I don't want to study that evolution. Okay, remember I always tell my students in classes, I'm not sure if I've said it in a video previously, in my class, I never tell you what to believe in. I never tell you what your values should be, what your beliefs should be, all right? So, I know I do have some students who do not believe in evolution or they have problems with the idea of evolution. It's not my job to address your beliefs. But since we do focus on this, there are scientists out there who study evolution, and that's what we learn about in a science class, and psychology is a science class. We don't ignore it, all right? We don't pretend like it's not there, even though we know some students are like, ooh, I don't want to learn about that, all right? So you don't have to believe in it. I'm just telling you like definitions and things. Like if you hear somebody use a particular term, I'm teaching you what they mean when they use that term. It's up to you. It's your responsibility to determine what you believe in and what you make of the information that you receive in your college classes. All right, so the evolutionary approach. All right. A lot of times when we think of evolution, we think of, physical characteristics evolving based on natural selection, based on which is most adaptive. Well, also behaviors. Behaviors can also be influenced by natural selection. And so the evolutionary approach, it tries to explore how human behavior has evolved because it has some kind of survival benefit. Certain behaviors we might engage in because they helped us survive, or in some cases they made us more attractive to potential mates so we could pass on our genes and contribute to the persistence of our personal characteristics in the gene pool, in the species. All right, so with evolutionary psychology, there are some tricky things with it. A lot of the things that are proposed would be best studied if we had a time machine. We don't. So there are some limitations for what we can directly test with evolutionary psychology, but there are different types of evidence that can be gathered to support some of the ideas that are proposed within evolutionary psychology. Now, we also have the socio-cultural perspective. All right, so it's got social and cultural in there. You can probably anticipate it has something to do with the larger environment that one is existing, functioning, developing within. They're kind of outside forces on the individual, based on your society, based on your culture. And so here we look at the influence of external factors, larger factors within a community, within the world, within your neighborhood, even within your family in some cases, and how they influence your behavior and mental processes. So this includes some of the things that we will talk about in social psychology, and also some of these things come up in developmental psychology and just kind of spread out with different topics. There are some times where we study something and we realize, you know what? We've learned a lot about this particular phenomenon, but we need to incorporate cultural forces, cultural factors. Like when we study child development, one thing that will often happen is we'll get these really interesting findings and we'll say, okay, this influences child development. And then another researcher will come along and say, guys, folks, I looked at different cultural groups and found differences. So, oh, we need to incorporate that. And then they'll expand their research and say, okay, well, this influences child development, but it depends on which culture you're developing in, the specific relationship that you have between these factors, these variables, these things that you're studying, these influences that you're studying. Important terms or ideas that are often included when we work within a socio-cultural perspective. Socioeconomic status. If you've never heard that term, sometimes people will use the term social class. When you say things like middle class, well, what's middle class? Where do those terms come from? There are folks like sociologists and other social scientists, including social psychologists, who look at people's standing or ranking within society. And we have figured out ways to put people into groups or classifications to look at various differences. And so socioeconomic status, which is often abbreviated SES, this includes a lot of people, when they hear it, they think income. That is a big part of it, but it actually includes 5 things. Income, wealth, and if you think income and wealth are the same thing, they're a little different. Income is money coming in. Wealth is like what you already have, what you've already amassed. It's possible to have one but not the other. Like maybe you inherited some wealth, but you don't have any income coming in. Or maybe you've got a lot of income coming in, but you have no wealth because all you ever do is pay off debts. All right, and other aspects, so in addition to those 2 aspects of socioeconomic status, or SES, you also have educational attainment, how much education you have received. and occupational status or occupational prestige, and neighborhood or residential quality. All of those things go into SES. And if you take developmental psychology with me at any point, I go into a little bit more detail about that. Beyond SES, race, ethnicity, gender, cultural background, language, depending on where you're living, and if you are speaking the majority language or a language that many people do not speak. And did I mention religion? Should be mentioned too. If I didn't mention religion is in there too. All of these things are socio-cultural factors in one's functioning or development. And any researcher who completely ignores these factors, they're not getting the whole picture. We've learned they are often very important. So this, even though this video was kind of a little bit longer than some of my other videos, this is actually the short version, all right? So this is just the introduction. Here, I'm just mentioning here are the 7 major perspectives. They're gonna come up again. So this is just like, hey, these things are coming up. Here are the basics. And finally, very importantly, it is important to point out that, with all these perspectives, sometimes students are like, well, which one's the right one? Is there a right one? Psychology, like many other subjects that you would learn about in college, a lot of it's one of the many where you get to a point where you're like, oh, there is no one right answer. There's a lot of perspectives on things. Okay, all right, it depends on what you're talking about. It depends on what evidence you have access to. And realistically, most psychologists take what we call an eclectic approach. Eclectic, think mix, all right? They draw on multiple different perspectives and theories to gain understanding of behavior and mental processes. It's very rare to find a psychologist who just follows one perspective. Most of them, you'll have people who are like, oh, well, I'm a clinical psychologist and I have both a behavioral and a cognitive approach. That's a pretty common thing. Or you'll have somebody say, oh, well, hey, I'm a developmental psychologist. I have a sociocultural and a biological approach, and I'm interested in cognition, and evolutionary forces. That's very common for people to draw on a mixture of the different perspectives. All right, so now that you know some of the different perspectives, we are also going to talk about different types of psychologists and different sort of careers that exist within the field.